Good evening, everyone, here in person and online. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas public talk series. My name is Mark Bowles. I'm the Dean and Head of the Tasmanian School of Business and Economics here at the University of Tasmania. And I'm delighted to host this event here tonight. This evening, we're broadcasting from Lutruwita, Tasmania, the unceded land of the Palawa and Murawina people, the traditional custodians of these lands. As we gather in Nipalina, Hobart, and talk about how we might create a secure and prosperous future for Tasmania, we reflect on the Palawa's deep history of knowledge sharing and caring for land. Theirs was a practice that sustained their people and this place for thousands of years. We pay our respect to elders past and present and to all members of the Aboriginal community joining us today. We stand for a future that is profoundly respectful and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history. Indeed, if you're joining us online tonight, we invite you to share your acknowledgement using the Q&A function. On behalf of the University of Tasmania, which also has at our core sustainability, I want to provide a warm welcome to all of you joining us here today. It's wonderful to see over 300 people here in person at the Stanley Burbury Theatre and around 200 people online. It's fabulous to get so many people engaged in important topics for Tasmania. The Island of Ideas series reflects the university's commitment to fostering critical conversations that inspire action and create meaningful change for Tasmania and beyond. Tonight's discussion is no different. In fact, it's one of immediate significance. In recent years, Tasmania has experienced both strong economic growth and, right now, quite significant fiscal challenges. While our economy reached a record of $40.6 billion in terms of gross state product, growing by $8.5 billion over the past decade, we're also facing a projected net debt approaching $10 billion in the coming years. This juxtaposition raises critical questions about the state's fiscal sustainability and our economic future. How do we balance growth with responsible long-term financial management? What strategies can ensure that prosperity benefits all Tasmanians without compromising our fiscal sustainability? As one of Australia's best known and widely respected economists, our expert tonight needs no introduction, especially here in Tasmania. He is an esteemed graduate of the University of Tasmania and a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. So Saul Eslake's career spans four decades, including as the Chief Economist of the ANZ Bank, the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and the Australian representative on the International Conference of Commercial Bank Economists. He's especially widely regarded for his clear, evidence-based insights on everything from housing through to international trade. Saul's contributions to public policy are profound in Australia and especially here in Tasmania. His work regularly informs policy decisions and public discourse, like here tonight and hopefully over the coming days and weeks. His recent review of Tasmania's public sector finances offers a candid look at the state's fiscal health, shedding light on how government spending decisions today will affect our economy in the years ahead. It's a privilege to have him here today to discuss Tasmania's debt dilemma. Please join me and welcome Saul Eslake.
Thank you, Mark, very much for that introduction. Congratulations on your recent appointment as Dean and Head of the School of Tasmania's Business and Economics School, and I'm sure you're going to make a great difference to the contribution it makes to discussions like the one that we're having tonight. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out in such large numbers on what was going to be a dark and stormy night. I'm not sure that it actually still is, but it certainly looked like it when I got off a plane at Hobart Airport from Sydney earlier this afternoon. And I also want to say a big thank you to Sarah Golden and her fabulous team for the way in which they put these events on. Some of you, I guess, were here in I think it was September last year when I spoke about the review of state finances that I did pursuant to the agreement between the Premier and the three Lambies, as they then were, as part of the agreement to provide confidence and supply, which the minority government needed in order to continue in government. And this evening, while I'm not going to go over all of that ground again, I do want to talk about the government's response, such as it was to my report, which was released concurrently with the normal mid-year review of the state's budget position, what in Tasmania is called the revised estimates report that was released on the 12th of February. But for those of you who weren't at that earlier occasion, I do want to begin with just a couple of definitions so that you're clear as to what I'm talking about when I do at different times. The first thing I want to explain is how Tasmania's public sector is divided up into three different components. And it's important to be clear as to what you're talking about when you're talking about things like deficit and debt. Most of the time, when people are talking about the government, they're talking about what the budget papers and the Stats Bureau call the general government sector, which consists of departments and agencies like Treasury and the Department of Education and the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and some other agencies like Parliament and the Office of the Governor and Tourism Tasmania and even TMAC, which for the most part are funded by taxation revenue, grants from the federal government and the like, and which typically don't charge for the services that they provide to individual Tasmanians or to the Tasmanian community as a whole. Then there is what is called the public non-financial corporations sector, which consists of what are commonly known as GBEs, government business enterprises, or SOCs, state-owned companies. They are businesses that are owned by the state government that, although they don't always make a profit, nonetheless, for the most part, generate revenue by selling services such as electricity or water to members of the public. And they're essentially meant to be self-financing. And then finally, there's the public financial corporation sector, which in Tasmania only includes two things. That is TasCorp, which borrows on behalf of the government and local councils, and the Motor Accident Insurance Board that runs the compulsory third-party insurance scheme. I'm not going to talk much about public financial corporations, but the other two are an important part of what I want to say this evening, and so I hope that makes clear the different parts that I'll be talking about. The other thing that I need to be clear about is what we're talking about when we talk about the government's bottom line, whether it's in surplus or deficit. Most state treasurers, irrespective of the political party they belong to, when they're talking about the budget bottom line, are typically referring to what the budget papers call the net operating balance, which is the difference between operating revenues, which is essentially all of them, that is state taxation, grants from the federal government, our share of GST revenue, dividends paid by government's business enterprises into the budget, revenue from traffic fines and things like that. That's all called operating revenue. And operating expenses, which are for the most part the cost of delivering services like schools, police, hospitals, but it also includes interest on the state's debt, depreciation, the running costs of the public service and the like. Note that operating revenue includes grants from the Commonwealth government that are for capital purposes like roads or building stadiums, and they're included in operating revenue even though the expenditure of that money is not included in operating expenditure. Rather, capital expenditures are included in what is called the fiscal balance, which is the difference between total revenues and total expenses, which are both operating expenses, as I've described, and capital expenses, or more commonly known these days as infrastructure investment. And those are so-called accrual accounting measures. That is, they're very similar to the ones that are used in the private sector by corporations ranging from BHP down to relatively small businesses. And they include some things for which no cash is outlaid, such as depreciation of the state's assets. The equivalent in cash accounting terms is simply the difference between cash in, receipts, and cash out, payments. And when people, including the federal treasurer, talk about the federal budget being in surplus or deficit, they're almost always talking about the cash deficit. But when, as I said before, state treasurers are talking about the state budget being in surplus or deficit, they're only talking usually about the so-called operating balance. And as I hope I've made clear now, that doesn't tell you the whole picture. In particular, it doesn't include infrastructure spending, which for the most part is financed by debt. In some ways, and I don't want to overdo the comparison, the net operating balance is similar to the profit of a company. So when BHP reports its net profit, it's basically what it gets from selling iron ore and other minerals, mainly to the Chinese, but to others. And it deducts from that the wages and salaries it pays to its workers and the depreciation of its assets and any interest it has on its debt. And, you know, being BHP, that's usually a big profit, some of which they use to pay for their capital expenditure on developing new mines. And in some ways, although you should never overdo the parallels between companies or households and governments, in a sense, that's what the net operating balance is, the quote net profit, or more often net loss. And the cash balance measures the sum of that and the amount that the government spends on infrastructure spending. And of course, it's the cash balance that drives net debt. In other words, if your cash receipts are less than your cash expenses or outgoings, whether they are for delivering services like schools and hospitals or paying for infrastructure like roads or stadiums, then you have to borrow. You have to add to net debt. If you want to pay down your debt, then you have to be getting more in revenue or receipts than you are shelling out in any kind of expense, in other words, to run a cash surplus in order to be able to begin to pay down debt. So again, I hope that, although it's probably not the most stimulating listening for you, does give you some sense of the kind of concepts that I want to be talking about tonight. And although I don't usually use quarterly data, it is published and it doesn't normally get a great deal of attention. If I put the quarterly data on a four-quarter moving total or a moving annual basis, it can give you a more timely sense of where the budget is than if you had to wait for the final year results, which for the current financial year aren't going to come out until the end of October. So we've got data up to the end of the December quarter, 31st of December, and that shows how rapidly Tasmania's financial position, however you measure it, whether by the net operating balance or the fiscal balance, they're the accrual accounting measures, remember, or the cash balance, which I think is the one that we ought to be focusing on, they deteriorated significantly during COVID, as they had to, and as they did almost all around the world. And then after a brief improvement, they have substantially deteriorated again. Note also that they started to deteriorate before COVID, around about 2017-18, and I'll show you another chart that highlights that more in a moment. What I should also emphasise is that the accrual accounting measures include the $571 million that the government provided in late June last year for the payment of compensation to survivors of child sexual abuse in state institutions as recommended by the Commission of Inquiry. Now, I'm of course not critical of that decision at all. It was a form of justice to people who suffered much. But what's important to note is, in this context, is that for the most part, that cash hasn't been paid out yet. They have just provided for it, and they will pay it out. I mean, I'm not suggesting there's anything, you know, the government's trying to shortchange the victims of child sexual abuse or anything like that, but in a sense, they've accounted for it in the measure of the budget bottom line that they most commonly use, the accrual accounting measure, even though for the most part, some cash has been paid out, but there's a lot more of that yet to come. So that money that's going to be paid to survivors of child sexual abuse in state institutions isn't yet reflected in the cash balance for the most part. It will be, but to some extent, the government, by deciding to make a provision for it on the 29th of June last year, or whenever it was, has kind of, put it in the past and hope that it won't show up in the measures that people look at or are encouraged to look at by the government to do it. The best you can say about this is that the deterioration in the position of the budget that's been going on for the last 2 or 3 years might now be coming to an end. If you look at the tail end of each of those charts after going south, or in the case of debt going north, they've just sort of moved sideways in the last quarter or so. So it might not be getting any worse, but it's certainly not getting any better. And there's no compelling reason to believe that it will get any better in the absence of some significant policy changes on the part either of this government or the next one. What we also observe, and here I'm talking about financial year numbers, is that successive forecasts of all of the 3 different measures of the budget's bottom line and of the debt that results from running those deficits keep getting worse. What I've shown here is the forecasts that were made in the 2023-24 budget for the current financial year and the 3 ones that follow. That's what they call the forward estimates period. I've shown the forecasts that were made in the budget brought down in 2023, the forecasts that were made in the budget brought down in September 24, and the latest forecasts which were released on the 12th of February 2025 in what, as I mentioned before, is called the revised estimates report. And you can see that in each of those occasions, all the measures of the state of the state's finances are getting worse. There is no improvement. There is certainly no path back to a cash surplus, which is what you need to have in order to stop accumulating debt, let alone starting to pay it down. There is no path back to a cash surplus, at least not by 2027-28, which is the last year of the current forward estimates period, and I would guess not by 2029-30. And when the Treasurer, Guy Barnett, says that the budget will be back in surplus by 2029-30, he's talking about the net operating balance, which completely includes the capital expenditures. And it's important to remember that in assessing anything the government says about the trajectory we're on. The Treasurer said the Premier said in his State of the State speech last week that when his party came to government in March 2014, he couldn't believe what he had inherited from the previous Labor or Labor Greens coalition government. In fact, as this chart shows, what they inherited was a budget that was actually in small cash surplus and which had money in the bank, as it were. That is, it had negative net debt. It owed less by way of debt, government bonds, than it had cash and other investments in the bank to offset that. If Mr. Rockliff wanted to say he couldn't believe something he'd inherited, what he should have said was that he couldn't believe what he had inherited from Peter Gutwein. Because what this chart makes clear, I hope, is that the deterioration in the general government, that's the core government financial position, happened under Mr. Gutwein's wash. For the first term of the, as it then was, Hodgman government, the government ran small budget surpluses and kept the state as a net creditor. That was in part because the Abbott government was surprisingly generous to Tasmania in its first couple of years in office. But beginning with the 2018 election, that is to say 2 years before the onset of COVID, the government, with Peter Gutwein as Treasurer, started running deficits. And at each of the ensuing elections, 2018, 2021, and 2024, the Liberal government promised to spend what by Tasmanian standards are substantial amounts of money between $1.5 and $2 billion over 4-year periods without saying a word as to how that would be paid for. And as you can see, while Tasmania's budget went into deficit and debt started to increase during COVID, as it had to do, I'm not critical of that. It started before COVID, and it has continued long after COVID has receded for the most part in the history books. And I would argue, although I didn't say this explicitly in the review that I undertook and published last year, that the state of Tasmania's finances is primarily down to mismanagement by the then Treasurer and Premier, subsequently Peter Gutwein, who perhaps once he realised what the state of Tasmania's finances were, toddled off and left the mess to be cleaned up by Mr. Rockcliffe and his colleagues. And although I'm not suggesting, I don't mean to suggest that they don't grasp the nature or dimensions of the problem, I think they do. To date, they haven't really been willing to do anything substantial in order to address that problem and start to put Tasmania's finances on the right trajectory. I just want to amplify a little further that point that I've just made, because it's obviously a very serious assertion, and I do it using figures that are published by the state government in the annual budget papers, where they break down changes in forecasts of the budget's bottom line. And here, because it's what they do, I'm using the so-called fiscal balance. That's the accrual accounting measure of the budget's bottom line that includes capital expenditure. They break down changes in the forecasts of the budget bottom line from one budget statement to the next into two sources. One is the result of conscious decisions by the state government to spend more money, or far less commonly to raise or cut taxes. They're called policy decisions. The other significant source of changes in the budget bottom line is things over which the government has no control at all, such as changes in the amount of revenue they get from the GST or from specific purpose grants from the federal government for things like schools and hospitals, or changes in the property market that result in them getting more or less stamp duty and land tax, changes in the jobs market that may result in them getting more or less payroll tax revenue, and other things over which they have very little control, such as how many people present themselves to the emergency departments at our hospitals and require expensive treatment. So at any point, the change in the condition of the budget, the movement in the surplus or deficit, can be broken down into the result of things that the government does control, policy decisions, and things which it doesn't. Parameter variations, they're called in the budget papers. And what this chart shows on the left for the period between 2017-18, when, as I argued, the rot started to set in, to 2023-24, which is the last completed financial year, policy decisions worsened the budget deficits recorded over those 7 years, by $9.1 billion, of which about 2/3 was offset by the fact that the economy was doing better than expected and more money was coming from Canberra and so forth, which offset that by about $6.6 billion. But the key message from that chart is that the deterioration in Tasmania's budget bottom line between 2017-18 and 2023-24 was entirely the result of decisions the government consciously made, mostly to increase spending. And if we look at what's projected for the next 4 years, the so-called forward estimates period, you can do the same thing. And what that shows is that conscious decisions by the government have worsened the bottom line by $3.5 billion, and favourable parameter variations, again, mostly the amount of money that gets handed to us from Canberra, or to some extent because the property market has done better than expected or employment has been stronger than expected, they've offset that by about $1.1 billion. So if you wanted to add it up over the 7 + 4, 11 years that we're talking about here, conscious government policy decisions have worsened the financial position by $12.6 billion, of which 7.7 has been kind of paid for by the economy doing a bit better than expected, or Canberra being more generous than had been assumed. But the deterioration in Tasmania's financial position hasn't been caused, as it was, for example, in the last couple of years of the previous Labor government, by the aftermath of the global financial crisis and the collapse of the forestry industry and so forth. That was mainly parameter variations rather than conscious decisions. This is something that the government has done itself. It wasn't done to it. It's the result of them consciously deciding, mostly at elections, to win votes, to spend lots of money without giving a moment's thought, at least not that any of us know about, to how that additional expenditure should be paid for. Now, the government likes to say that if you look at what they call the general government sector, again, to emphasise that's the core operations of government departments and agencies that are funded by taxation revenue or grants from Canberra, we're not the worst in the country. And in some respects, that's true. The Northern Territory, for example, is running bigger deficits in at least a couple of the next few years as a proportion of their economy than we are. And Queensland's financial position has substantially deteriorated according to the first set of estimates elected by the new Queensland government that took office in October last year, but released their first view of the situation they'd inherited from their predecessors on the 31st of January this year. And the government also likes to say that although Tasmania's general government net debt has gone up, it's not as bad as the Victoria or the Northern Territory, as if somehow that makes it quite not so bad, as if Victoria or the Northern Territory is setting a benchmark for sensible fiscal management. But again, as is often the case with what the government wants you to understand, they're not giving you the full picture. In particular, because Tasmania has, relative to the size of our economy, an enormous burden of unfunded public sector superannuation liabilities. Now, that's not this government's fault, because David Crean in particular, while he was Treasurer, and to some extent it happened a bit under the previous Liberal governments, when they were running budget surpluses, were putting some of that away in what was then called the Superannuation Provision Account, or SPAR, to defray some of these readily forecastable future liabilities, in much the same way as the federal government under Peter Costello set up the Future Fund and deposited budget surpluses and the proceeds of selling Telstra, and that's now worth something like $180 billion. But all of the money that had been put aside in the SPAR in the late 90s and early 2000s was emptied out by Paul Lennon's, David Bartlett's and Lara Giddings' budget. So there's nothing in there to offset those liabilities. And this government hasn't done anything to do it. It's, as I say, it's not their fault that that problem is there. But the problem is there. And this is, in a sense, a debt, a liability that has to be serviced by making pension payments to those public sector employees who were fortunate enough to be members of these defined benefit schemes before they were closed down in the late 90s or early 2000s. That's an obligation from which the government can't escape. And it's bigger than that of any other government, including, notwithstanding what the chart says, the ACT, because the ACT government actually has been putting money aside to defray its liabilities. It's just that they put it in the Commonwealth Government Superannuation Fund for historical reasons. And under accounting rules, they're not allowed to count that as assets because it's the federal government's fund, not theirs. So Tasmania has the worst unfunded liability of any state relative to the size of our economy. And if you add that to net debt, which you should, then Tasmania's net financial liabilities, as that concept's called, are the biggest in the country with the exception of the Northern Territory, and that's nothing to be proud of. But that's not the full picture either, because Tasmania also has, as you all know if you think about it, a relatively large government business enterprise, or as I defined it at the beginning, public non-financial corporation sector. Unlike Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, and to some extent Queensland, the electricity generating business is still in state hands, as it is in Western Australia. and as it is, with the exception of the energy retailer in Brisbane, as it is in Queensland. We have a state-owned shipping company, which no other state has. And so relative to the rest of the country, now our GBEs matter. They employ a lot of people, they do important things, and they have big debts and deficits. So when you add those in to look at the total non-financial public sector, that is, I'm not including Tascorp and the MAIB, but I'm including Hydro and Tas Networks and all of those things. The cash deficits which Tasmania's non-financial public sector is running are the biggest relative to the size of the Tasmanian economy of any state or territory. And their net financial liabilities, including the unfunded superannuation, are the biggest of any state or territory, remembering, as I said before, that the ACT actually does have assets to defray its super liabilities, but they're held in the Commonwealth Super Fund where, under the accounting rules, they don't count. So Tasmania's financial position is, when you define it properly, the worst of any state or territory, and there's no kind of getting away from that. The government wants to say that it has a fiscal strategy that will get us away from, well, they don't actually acknowledge we're in the worst position of any state or territory, but from wherever they say we are to somewhere that wouldn't look quite as dire. I said in my report, I think they have too many fiscal strategy targets. You don't need 11 or 12, which they have. You don't need that many, particularly because some of them are contradictory. But as you can see here, they're not meeting very many of them. On a strict definition, they're only meeting one, and that's actually not a very helpful one, because it's saying you meet that one by spending lots of money on infrastructure, more than what you fund by depreciation provisions on existing assets. Yes, they're meeting that one, they're spending lots of money on infrastructure. That's actually part of the problem, because they're paying for it with debt. They're not paying for part of it by running an operating surplus. And let me say here, it's not wrong for governments to fund part of their infrastructure spending programs through debt, because that's a way of making the future generations who will benefit from that infrastructure contribute something to the cost of providing things from which they will get benefit. But if you are funding all of your infrastructure spending by debt, then what you're effectively saying is future generations will be paying for all of the cost of providing that infrastructure, and the current generation, who are deriving some benefit from it, aren't paying anything for it at all. Indeed, when you're running an operating deficit, what you're effectively saying is that future generations have to pay for the services, schools, hospitals, policing, environmental protection, whatever, that the current generation is presumably benefiting from. But the other point I'd make here, and I'm going to come back to it when I talk about the government's response to my report, is that the fiscal strategy targets that actually matter, the ones that if they met them would actually help dig us out of the hole that we're now in, they're not meeting any of them. And you kind of ask, what's the point of having fiscal strategy targets if, when you're not meeting them, you don't do something to ensure that you will at some point meeting them? And I'm not saying, when I say that, I'm not saying the government should be doing whatever it takes to make them meet all those strategy targets by June next year. This problem is built up over a long period of time. You can't correct it in 6 months. But they're not planning on current policies to correct it, any of them, in the next 4 years. Most of them on current policy settings will end up getting worse. Now, as I said before, I presented the review of state finances that I did pursuant to the agreement between the Premier and the Lambys in August last year. I wrote that myself, didn't have anyone else helping me do it, and I did it in a little under 2 months, and I wasn't working full-time on that for those 2 months. Government has had 6 months, presumably with all the resources of Treasury and maybe other departments available to it as well. And they produced a response on the 10th of February. I have to make a little confession here that in late January, early February, I said to, I think, 3 or 4 people that if the government hadn't come out with a comprehensive response to my report that the former Treasurer Michael Ferguson had promised by the 6-month anniversary of the release of my report, which would have been the 19th of February, I'd probably have something pretty scathing to say. Now, maybe I shouldn't have said that, because as I understand it, word of that got back to the government and they thought, should we better prepare a response then? And that response was clearly prepared in a great deal of haste, because it wasn't included in the revised estimates report document, as you might have thought it would be, as Michael Ferguson's initial, very short, but nonetheless formal response to my report was included in the budget papers, they're printed by Treasury. Now, in order to get this one, you had to go to a press release issued by the Treasurer, click on that hyperlink that you can see there, and when you did that, it took you to there, which is not the way you normally access government documents. So it was clearly a rush job. And when you read it, my response was that a lot of it read like it was written by this guy, Sir Humphrey Appleby. And, clearly there are a few people in the room who are my age who remember who Sir Humphrey Appleby was and who he used to advise the fictional Prime Minister James Hack. Let's just look at some of what they said. An amendment to the Charter of Budget Responsibility is not necessary, as removing that existing requirements would erode the utility and value of the legislation. What does that mean? Or you can read that for yourself. Yeah. Here's another one. Or this one here. This one's worth reading. In the government's view, the measures recommended in the review significantly overlap with the existing fiscal strategy, and the government considers there's limited or marginal utility in expanding the scope of the measures in the budget to include a further range of measures. Now, as it happens, the actors who played Sir Humphrey and Jim Hacker, they're both passed away. But, I kind of suspect if they're up there, they'd be looking at about this and kind of chuckling to each other that their legacy lives on. This was hastily written, poorly thought out stuff. So let me go into a little bit more detail about that. The government claims that in many ways, the recommendations in the independent review are consistent with the government's fiscal strategy. Well, at the risk of sounding like John Cleese in a Monty Python movie, no, they're not. And I'll explain why in a minute. The government went on to say that its fiscal strategy, together with the pre-existing legislative framework, sufficiently provide the government with the flexibility, control and responsiveness to adequately manage the state finances. Well, again, no, it doesn't. And I think I've shown you charts which illustrate why I have that view. If the pre-existing legislative framework was sufficient, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in. It isn't sufficient, because for the third time in 35 years, we found ourselves in a mess. The most recent revised estimates report, as I said, on a generous interpretation, shows that 5 of their 11 or 12 fiscal strategy targets aren't being met. And my guess is that another 4 of them either aren't being met or won't be met over the next 4 years. So again, what's the point of having fiscal strategy targets if, when you're not meeting them, you don't do anything that ensures that at some point you will meet them? The government comprehensively rejected my recommendations for raising additional revenue. For that matter, I should, to be fair, say that the opposition did as well within 24 hours of my report being released. That didn't completely surprise me, because to be as fair as I can, the government was elected on a platform of not increasing any existing taxes, apart from, we're meant to forget, the short stay accommodation levy, which they did promise and which hasn't been introduced. But I guess it's unrealistic to expect a government to break a promise that there'd be no new taxes. So when I wrote the recommendations about revenues that I did, I was thinking to myself, they're for a future government. Either the current one without a pledge not to increase taxes, or a different government. That's for the people to decide, not for me. But what I was really surprised by, disappointed by, and as I reflected on it in subsequent weeks, a bit angered by, is the government's rejection of other recommendations that I thought they could have taken up. As you might recall, I rejected crude mechanisms to cut government spending, such as efficiency dividends and vacancy control, or as it's now called, distinguishing between essential workers and non-essential workers, and not hiring any of the latter. And I did that in part, of course, my own experience in the corporate sector. I went through 3 episodes of this in the 14 years I was working for ANZ, and I can tell you what the result is. What happens is, the chief executive calls his direct reports in and says, we're only making $2.5 billion this year. That's not enough. You guys need to cut your operating expenses by 10%. And those guys then call in their direct reports and says, the boss says you've got to cut operating expenses by 10%, so you go and do it. And they then call in their direct reports. And the decisions as to who gets sacked are taken by the lowest level of management capable of taking them. And the result of that is, and again, I say this from direct personal experience, you have, for example, people earning $200,000 a year or more, standing outside locked doors, waiting for someone else who's on $200,000 a year to stop doing what they're doing and get up and let them into the office to go to the meeting they're there for, because the receptionist on $35,000 a year is the one who's been sacked. That's what happens when you do that sort of thing. And that's vacancy control and so forth. Efficiency dividends, that is just the government saying to the head of each department, you've got to reduce your spending by 5%, is a lazy way of cutting spending, because it's effectively ministers absolving themselves from the responsibility of deciding which programs should be cut and which ones aren't. And in the end, what tends to happen is that the same percentage gets cut off all of them, and the result is almost always lower efficiency and reduced standards of services to the people who expect those services. It's a lazy way of cutting spending, and it usually doesn't work, but the government has decided to press on with those. They have also, and I was even more surprised by this, rejected or ignored almost all of the recommendations I made for improving the rules around the presentation of financial information to the Parliament, and through the Parliament to the people of Tasmania. The rules around how budgets are framed, which is in the Charter of Budget Responsibility Act, and some of the rules that are in that act for how political parties should tell the people what they're planning to do during election campaigns. Tasmania is actually a bit ahead of some other states in that the Charter of Budget Responsibility Act requires political parties to put out a fiscal strategy saying, what is going to be the bottom line impact of what they're proposing to do, of their promises, before the election is held. Not many other states, and the feds don't require that. But that requirement's honoured much more in the breach than in the observance, because what the political parties do typically is release a pretty scant document these days at 5 o'clock the day before the election. Despite the fact that, of course, as you know, these days upwards a third of people vote early. Postal ballots, or they go to early voting, and they won't ever have seen this. And increasingly, although this requirement used to be taken quite seriously, Tim Morris of the Greens, when he was their finance spokesman, actually used to do a really good job of it. The Liberals did a reasonable job of it the year before they got elected in 2014. Other parties haven't really taken that requirement seriously, but they should. I'm not saying that there ought to be laws against promising to spend more money or to cut taxes. That's for the people to decide themselves in a democracy, but there ought to be a law that says, if you're going to spend more money, tell the people how you're going to pay for it. If you're going to cut taxes, tell the people what other taxes you're going to raise or what spending you're going to cut in order to pay for it. Or if you actually want the people to vote for spending and leave the payment of it to their children and grandchildren, tell them that that's what you're doing. That ought to be a requirement, in my view, of a functioning democracy. But as I say, I thought all of these recommendations were pretty innocuous, but the government thumbed its nose at virtually all of them. And I'm not going to dwell on these at length, because I did talk about them last time, but I hope you can see relatively quickly here that these are not asking any of the major parties to break with their underlying philosophical principles. There's nothing in what the Liberal Party believes, what the Labor Party believes, or what the Greens believe, although the Greens have been more supportive of most of this stuff. These are things that you can find in other jurisdictions or in better run countries in other parts of the world that would help prevent what has happened in Tasmania over the last 11 years and what happened in the 1980s under Robin Gray from happening again, which is, I think, the fact that this is the third time in 35 years that we found ourselves in this mess kind of tells you something is wrong with the rules that govern the way in which budgets are put together. But as I say, all of this was unfortunately a bridge too far to the government. Instead, the government has decided to explore whether asset sales can be used to reduce debt. Now, I said in my report that although I wasn't ideologically opposed to that at all times in all places, I didn't think it would stack up in most cases, in part because the savings you make from using the proceeds of asset sales to pay down debt in not having to pay interest will be less than they were in the 90s when lots of other governments were doing this, because interest rates on government debt are a lot lower than they were back then. And also because in many cases, particularly Hydro Tasmania, but some other government businesses as well, are paying a bigger share of their profits to the government by way of dividends and tax equivalents, which of course, if you sell the assets, you no longer get. I also said that, and I think it's evident in the reaction to the government's proposals over the last couple of weeks, the last week, that doing this now would require the expenditure of a lot of political capital, because it's unpopular, that I thought would be better allocated to selling some of the other things that I recommended, such as raising a range of state taxes. Nonetheless, the government has, much to the consternation of one of its principal political advisors, asked me to give them some advice on this subject. And although I did ask myself, was I likely to be wasting my time given the government's reaction to that review? Nonetheless, I guess I sort of have the view that if your government asks you for some help and you're capable of giving it, then you really ought to do it unless you have a very good reason not to do. So I'm going to do it. I'm doing it with an open mind, neither in principle committed to nor opposed to the idea that governments must run things and the private sector never should, or the other way around. But as an economist, I'd still think that a key question to be answered is the one that I thought about in my review, namely whether it actually makes financial sense to sell any particular government asset. And in order to illustrate that, what I want to show you is a hypothetical example and just kind of work through it. The budget papers tell us that the three electricity businesses which the government owns were worth 3.75 billion. That's the valuation they're included in the budget papers for. The three of them together are worth 3.75 billion. And the budget papers tell us that they pay into the budget in the current year a little over 200 million, and that's expected to rise to 252 million over the next 3 years. Now, if the government were able to sell those three businesses, and this is deliberately not what they're proposing, because remember, they're saying they're not proposing to sell the hydro. That's why I'm choosing this as an example, because I don't want to preempt here what I might end up concluding when I actually do the work the government has asked me to do. But just hypothetically, if you could sell them for what the budget papers say they're worth, 3.75 billion, bearing in mind the interest rate on government debt is assumed to be 5.3% this year, then you would save about $199 million in interest by using that 3.75 billion to pay down debt. So what that example says, and I emphasize again, it's a hypothetical example, that the government would be worse off financially by selling those three businesses and using the proceeds to pay down debt. Now, actually, to be fair, the Premier isn't saying they're going to pay down debt. They're going to invest those proceeds, a bit like the federal government has done with the Future Fund, and use the revenue from that to meet the interest. And if they can invest it in a way that produces a bigger return than the interest rate on government bonds, which the Future Fund has been able to do by quite a wide margin over the last 25 years since it was set up, then the arithmetic might work around the other way, in which case it might be a financial decision, but then you have to consider all the other ramifications, potential loss of employment, potential increase in prices that may occur. You can perhaps put in place regulations to prevent that happening or legislation to prevent it happening, but they're the sort of questions that will need to be considered by me when I report to the government in response to their request. And as I say, I want to emphasise this here, I haven't made up my mind about any of that. But that's the sort of consideration that the government will have to give if it chooses to go down that path as a way of reducing either debt itself or the net cost of servicing it. And they seem to have ruled out almost all of the other options. The problem that the government has, and it's unavoidable, is that anything they do to get on top of the deficit and debt position, which they created, is going to have a negative impact on the economy in at least the short term. The government likes to say, and they said this after the release of the national accounts figures, the GDP figures that came out last Wednesday, that Tasmania was outperforming the nation because what in the GDP accounts is called state final demand. That's the sum of spending by households, businesses and governments within the state. It excludes international and interstate trade. That state final demand was growing at a faster rate in Tasmania than the national average, which is what that chart shows. When you unpick it a bit more, however, what you can see is that Tasmania's state final demand is growing at a faster rate than the rest of the country solely because of public spending. And that if you look at private sector spending, that is household spending, dwelling investment, business investment, that's actually growing at a slower rate than Tasmania than in the rest of the country. In other words, to the extent that Tasmania's economy is outperforming, it's because the government is spending lots of money, even federal as well as state governments, but they're not paying for it. They're running deficits. They're doing it with borrowed money. And if you look at a range of other indicators of private sector economic activity, whether it's retail sales or building approvals, it's business confidence or business investment or employment, Tasmania is doing worse than the rest of the country. The government again would like to say, well, actually the unemployment rate in Tasmania is, in some months, been lower than the national average, has been closer to the national average than it usually has been in Tasmanian history. What they don't tell you is the reason for that is that there's been a significant decline in the number of Tasmanians who are either working or actively looking for work, whereas in the rest of Australia, it's at a record high. In other words, the unemployment rate in Tasmania is artificially low because people who might otherwise have been out there looking for work and be counted as unemployed are instead doing something else. So, on most indications, Tasmania's economy is not doing better than the rest of the country. It's doing worse. And it's a sad fact of life that anything they do to improve the budget, which they're going to have to do sooner or later, will in the short term make it even more worse. But if they don't do it reasonably soon, then when someone gets around to doing it, the economic impact of it will be bigger than it otherwise was. And that's part of the reason why one of my key recommendations was that the government should, in order to dig Tasmania out of the hole that it has put Tasmania in, do more on the revenue side than the spending side. And I want to finish by explaining to you why I came to that view. And I came to that view using assessments that are prepared every year by the Commonwealth Grants Commission as part of the process by which it recommends every April how the GST revenue should be carved up among the states and territories with a view to enabling each state and territory to provide the average level of services like schools, hospitals and policing, whilst levying on its citizens the average level of state taxes, payroll tax, stamp duty, land tax. And that's been an objective of Australian government policy since 1936. In the aftermath of what we now call the Wexit referendum, when Western Australians voted 2-1 to secede from the Commonwealth in 1933, only to be told by the British Parliament afterwards, you know that bit at the beginning of the Constitution that says one indissoluble Commonwealth, it means what it says. But the federal government's response at the time, because WA did have some legitimate concerns that led their voters to want to secede from the Commonwealth, was to start handing out federal government money to the states in a way that recognised that it cost more in some states to deliver services than it did in others, including Western Australia, where what is still a relatively small population is scattered over a huge area, and that states differed in terms of their capacity to raise revenue from things like payroll tax and stamp duty and mineral royalties. And so here in Tasmania, for example, because wages are typically 10 to 15% lower than they are on the mainland, a given rate of payroll tax is going to raise less revenue than it will in New South Wales or Western Australia or the ACT, where wages are higher. Or a given rate of land tax will typically raise less revenue because land prices are lower here than they are in, for example, New South Wales. And they recognise, for example, that because Tasmania has an older and sicker population than the rest of the country, we need to spend more on health in order to deliver the same standard of services as in, say, the ACT, where people are younger and typically healthier. Or the Northern Territory does pretty well out of this because the Grants Commission recognises that the NT has a relatively large First Nations population living in pretty remote areas that are expensive to service. One of the ironies is that the NT government actually doesn't spend much of the money it gets on delivering services to First Nations people, but nonetheless, the Grants Commission's principle is to put them in a position where they can, if they choose to do. It doesn't dictate what they do. It just enables them to do it. And I've always argued this is one of the things that makes Australia a better country than the United States, that it doesn't matter nearly as much as it does in the United States or even in Canada or Germany, which state you live in, as to the quality of schooling your kids get, the quality of healthcare that you and your family get, or the quality of policing that your community gets, in a way that it does in the United States. And that's why I get so angry about the way that system has been corrupted by Western Australia. The biggest single spending program in the federal budget is the distribution of GST revenues. But because of the political power Western Australia has had since the 2016 election, which the Turnbull government only won by 1 seat, which they did because they won 12 out of 15 in WA, and then at the 22 election that was flipped over when Albanese won by 1 seat, because he won 4 seats off the coalition in WA and the coalition lost another one to a Teal. Western Australia has literally had the country by you-know-what, and they've squeezed as hard as they can, and basically it's a bipartisan policy, that is both Labor and coalition, that what WA wants, WA gets. And so as a result of the corruption of this process, the federal government is gifting $54 billion over 11 years to the government of the richest state in the country, richer than any other state has ever been in Australia's history, so that its premier can go around during election campaigns promising households $5,000 in cash plus a $10,000 interest-free loan in order to install solar panels or solar batteries in their homes. Meanwhile, if you actually thought maybe it would be better to increase the job search allowance or the Commonwealth rent assistance to pensioners who rent, we could actually afford to do that if we weren't giving $54 billion to appease the greed of Australia's richest state, which is a bipartisan policy, unfortunately. But anyway, to come back to the point, every year the Grants Commission works out how much each state would need to spend per head of population in order to provide its citizens with the same range and quality of services as the average of all states and territories. And it works out how much each state could raise if they had the average regime of state taxes, payroll tax, land duty, mineral royalties, and that sort of thing. And then it distributes the GST in such a way as to give each state the capacity, if it chooses, to provide the average level of services whilst imposing the average level of state taxes. And as you can see, Tasmania has an above average requirement to spend per head of population, whilst having less capacity per head to raise revenue from the sources that the Constitution allows state governments to have, which is why we get a much bigger share of GST revenue than we would if it were carved up on an equal per capita basis, which is what New South Wales and Victoria have always wanted, and Western Australia, although it didn't when it was a claimant state, after they got, to use a Keatingism, kissed on the nether regions by a Chinese rainbow, they wanted the rules that worked for them so long to be changed so they didn't have to put into the pot from which they had so happily drawn. But what you can then do with the figures that the Grants Commission publishes is compare what each state is actually doing with what the Grants Commission reckons they would need to do in order to raise the average level of revenue and provide the average level of services. And when you do that, what you see is that Tasmania is spending about 7% per head less on delivering services than the Grants Commission reckons it would need to in order to provide the average level of services, but that it's also raising about 4%, 4.5% less than it would if its state tax regime was equivalent to that of the rest of the country. Now, don't take too much notice to the ACT here again, because remember, the ACT government is also the Canberra City Council. So they have some local government responsibilities, and they have local government revenue raising powers like municipal rates, which other state governments have. So I include them for completeness, but they're not really relevant to the consideration. This comparison, the fact that the Grants Commission, and in Tasmania, you challenge these figures at your peril because they're the basis for us getting such a good deal out of the GST revenue sharing arrangements. What that's telling you is that if you were to attempt to solve Tasmania's financial problems primarily by cutting spending, you would be making the services that Tasmanians get even worse than they already are. And the burden of that would fall disproportionately, of course, on that part of the Tasmanian population that's most in need of those services, which pretty much most of the time is in the bottom half of the income distribution. So I was kind of recommending against that. Although I've been critical of the government for promising to spend and keeping its promises to spend lots of money, my criticism has not been, for the most part, of the individual spending decisions. I'm not going to criticise the government for wanting to employ more nurses and doctors or more teachers. We need to do that. What I am critical of is their complete unwillingness to pay for it. And the thing about raising state taxes, while it's not nice, number one, most state taxes are paid by business. They are therefore a deduction against federal income tax, which in turn means that, in fact, 30% of any increase in state taxes on businesses is paid by the feds in lower company tax. Or if it's an unincorporated business, maybe as much as 47% of it is paid for, in effect, by the federal government collecting less income tax. So, why wouldn't you want to do that? The second thing about it is that while there are some state taxes that are paid by individuals, land tax, stamp duty when you purchase a home, motor vehicle registration, stamp duty and charges, you can structure most of those in a way that exempt less affluent families from having to pay them. For example, I recommended that Tasmania, which has the lowest motor vehicle registration fees and lowest stamp duty on motor vehicles of any state except South Australia, or to raise them to somewhere like where they are in Victoria and New South Wales for cars that are worth more than $60,000. What's wrong with that? Or I recommended, as every economist who looks at this does, that stamp duty be abolished and replaced with a land tax that includes owner-occupied property, because there's something fundamentally unfair about a system of property taxation that expects people who, for whatever reason, move home 4 or 5 times in their lifetime, because they start with a small home and have kids and want a bigger one, and then they downsize, or because there's divorce, or they have to move for a job. Our system, every state system of property taxation, expects someone who, for whatever reason, moves home 4 or 5 times in their life to contribute more through stamp duty to the cost of providing schools, hospitals, policing, environmental protection than someone who buys the same home and lives in it for 50 years. That's unfair. But if you got rid of stamp duty and replaced it with a broadly based land tax, you could exempt land that was worth less than, say, $100,000 from the tax. Or you could say to pensioners, you don't have to pay it, it will be a charge against your estate when you die. And lots of local governments on the mainland do that with council rates. We could do it with a land tax applied at the state level. So it is possible to structure increases in state taxes so that they don't have any discernible impact on the least affluent parts of the population. And that's kind of what I recommended that they should do. But unfortunately, the government, and to be fair, the opposition, have thumbed their nose at these recommendations. So the end result is that at some point in the future, presumably not in the life of the present Parliament, however long that turns out to be, and that's in the hands of the opposition and the crossbenchers, I get, solving the debt dilemma that Tasmania has is going to hurt. What our political leaders need to decide, and indeed what we need to decide when we elect those who represent us in Parliament, is who do we want to hurt least? And given that we have to do hurt some people in order to fix this problem rather than leaving it to future generations to bear, how do we structure whatever we do in a way that does the least damage to the economy, the least damage to employment and to businesses, and is also the fairest? And my point is that unless that's carefully thought through, it's going to have serious and lasting economic consequences, which we don't really have to put up with. And that's the second time in the last 9 months that I've said that. Neville Wran used to say, the former Premier of New South Wales, that until you're sick of hearing yourself say the same thing over and over again, you haven't begun to make an impact. Maybe that's a lesson I'm having to learn the hard way as well, but hopefully sharing these thoughts with you has helped improve your understanding of what needs to be done and will thus lead you to make more informed votes when the time comes to cast your vote. Thank you very much for allowing me to share those thoughts with you.
Thank you so much, Saul. So you can take it for granted that for an economist like me, that a night like tonight is exciting as a Rolling Stones concert. And there's a few economists scattered in the audience. But for the rest of the audience for whom budget papers can be quite mystical, I think what you've really done for us is really help simplify what is for everyone a very complex topic, but one that's really important as well, given by the numbers of people who have turned up today. We now have some time for questions. I guess I'm going to take the liberty of asking you a question myself. Tasmania ultimately is a parliamentary democracy. We all have one degree of access to our local member or another. Sometimes you see them in the supermarket, or you can write to them. You've provided a lot of recommendations. If someone was to talk to their local member, government, opposition, independent, what would you be recommending they say?
Oh, goodness. Part of my answer would probably be the way to dig ourselves out of the hole that we've been dug into is more by finding ways to pay for the spending that people obviously value and that meets identifiable needs, than to cut spending. And if you do have to cut spending, kind of do it in a thoughtful, strategic way, rather than by resorting to crude measures that don't work in the private sector and won't work in the public sector either. That would be one. And if I had an extra moment, it would be, as I said in the presentation, this is the third time in 35 years we've found ourselves in this position. That tells you there is something wrong with the rules surrounding how budgets are put together and what governments are allowed to do. Let's strengthen the rules so that this can't happen a fourth time in 50 years.
So we're not looking for an Elon Musk approach to cutting costs then. So a couple of questions from the audience.
Thanks very much, Saul, for a really good presentation. One thing that you didn't mention was the fact that we went to an enlarged parliament, and I wonder what you had expected, if anything, that might come from that in terms of the way fiscal decision making was made and how it's actually turned out. And it seems to me that we've got a parliament now that's incapable of making hard decisions. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, thanks for the question, Graham. There's a couple of things I'd say about that. First of all, while I supported the decision to enlarge the parliament, to reverse the decision that was made in 98, I thought, and I said, not that anyone listened, it should have been done in a different way. Rather than going back to the system of 7 members from 5 electorates, what we should have done was 5 from 7. And that would have done 2 things. One, and there are arguments for and against this, but it would have kept the higher threshold for entering Parliament, which was supposedly one of the objectives of reducing it from 35 to 25 in 98. But the second thing is it would have, I think, provided a way of dealing with 2 very serious anomalies in our electoral map, one of which is the eastern shore of Hobart, which I sometimes call the Nagorno-Karabakh of Tasmania. That is, it's a kind of exclave. And, people, I live at Acton Park, right? And I grew up as a kid in Howrah, partly. People on the eastern shore have no community of interest with people in Kingborough and the Huon Valley. That's not a criticism. There is just no community of interest. And if we had 5 from 7, you could have had an electorate largely based on the eastern shore that probably would have extended into southern parts of what's now Lyons, maybe the Tasman Peninsula, maybe Sorell. But that would have solved the other problem, which is that Lyons is a dreadful electorate for people to have to represent. Again, what's the community of interest between Maydena and Deloraine? Or up north of St Helens and all the way down to Sorell, that you could have solved that problem as well. And I think that would have been better for democracy if we'd done that. The other thing I'd say, however, is that Tasmania's own experience does not support the proposition that minority governments are bad. I would say 2 of Tasmania's best governments in my lifetime were Michael Field's and the one led by Tony Rundle that wasn't a coalition with the Greens, but was supported by Christine Milne as the leader of them. Both of them did things that, in Michael Field's case, cleaned up the mess that was left by Robin Gray. And in Rundle's case, actually set down a lot of the policies that Bacon and Crean implemented and for which they got a lot of political credit. And of course, Tony Rundle lost the election in 98 because he advocated selling the hydro in particular, and the hydro as it then was, and they exploited it. Whereas by contrast, I think the worst government Tasmania has ever had was Robin Gray's government. But, Robin Gray effectively had a majority in both houses of Parliament, with Conservative independents in the upper house. And there is no one who's done more damage to the economic and social fabric of Tasmania over the entire course of his adult lifetime than Robin Gray. And he had a majority. So majority governments are not always good. Minority governments can actually achieve quite a lot if the government figures out how to work with them. People will have their own views about the government that Julia Gillard led, but it passed a lot of legislation. People will have their views about whether that was good legislation or not, but they were able to pass a lot of legislation. And one of their legacies, of course, was something I recommended in the Tasmanian context, which was the Parliamentary Budget Office. So, it remains to be seen whether this Parliament works more effectively than the last one. I mean, remember, part of my argument was that the deterioration in Tasmania's financial position occurred during a period when we had, as we were reminded every day, a majority Liberal government. And when, as we were reminded every day, Tasmania was outperforming the rest of the country. The problem was that the government of the day had political capital but refused to spend it. Partly because of the advice they were getting from someone who is kind of held up as being a political genius, even though every campaign he's run has resulted in a drop in the Liberal vote. But time will tell whether this Parliament has proven to be as workable and produce good results as the other 2 experiences of minority government that we've had in the last 30 years.
Thank you. Just wondering, do we really have to pay $1 billion for an extra 3,000 seats at a new stadium?
Let me answer that in a couple of ways as best I can. One is that as someone who has, longer than most people, advocated for the AFL to become the truly national competition that for a long period of time it's falsely claimed to be, it sticks in my craw that we're expected to do something that no other state was asked to do. No one asked Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland or New South Wales to build a new stadium in order to host one team, let alone two, that they've all got. We are in Hobart, the second driest capital in the country. It rains, less than half what it does in Sydney. And as we've been reminded, it can rain an awful lot in Brisbane. And yet no one's asked them to have a roof with a covered stadium. I have a suspicion, which I cannot prove, it's just the cynic in me, that says that the AFL was making demands it thought Tasmania would say no to, so that they could then turn around and say, see, you're not really serious. And that to their surprise, Tasmania kept saying yes. And of course, the guy who kept saying yes then left, as he did with some other things, left the problem for his successor to clean up. Now, that's my first point. The second point I'd make is that the AFL has Tasmania in the same position that Donald Trump has Canada or has Ukraine. We don't have any cards. I hate this sort of stuff, but this is the way the world is becoming. We don't have any cards to deal with the AFL. So if we don't give them what they're demanding of us, we might not have a team. Maybe in the end that's what to happen, but I would be very sad about it. Similarly, I'm very sad that something I had always thought would be a unifying thing for Tasmanians has instead become a source of social division. And I'm really saddened by that. I can't blame any. If we were in a better financial position than we are, then my answer to your question would have been yes. But even if we were in a better position than we are, I would nonetheless readily understand why lots of people say, if we can afford however much it costs to build a stadium, how come our schools and hospitals are so whatever? And so, it comes, Nick Gruen, who was asked commission to do his report by the Lambies, and the government went along with that. He's presented, I think, a thoughtful, credible report on the finances of the stadium, and I'm pretty supportive of the conclusions to which he came.
So I'll take a question online now. So this is from an anonymous attendee. When you say that fixing debt will hurt, can you provide a comparison to the so-called recession we had to have?
Well, the recession we had to have, as Paul Keating famously called it, was not brought on by a desire to pay down debt. In fact, in the years leading up to that recession, the Keating government had, the Hawke government in which Keating was Treasurer, had run budget surpluses, for the first time in yonks. That recession was brought on, actually, what Keating was saying beforehand, in order to reduce Australia's chronic current account deficits. After the event, they said it was to bring down inflation, but it wasn't to bring down debt. I think a more relevant example that I'd say to your listener is what Victoria went through in the early 90s, in the aftermath of the Kane-Jolly spend-a-thon. And some of the things that Kane and Jolly did as the government of Victoria in the 1980s to conceal how much they were borrowing, used techniques that Enron later made famous. It was pretty disgraceful. Kennett was elected in 1992 on a platform that essentially said, you know what I've got to do and I'm going to do it. And so, they did cut spending. And remember, this was a Liberal government, they imposed a $100 deficit levy as a supplement on rates, a surcharge on municipal rates everyone had to pay for 2 years. They cut a lot of spending on schools and hospitals and that sort of thing. Victoria was already experiencing a worse recession than the rest of the country because of the effects of the collapse of the state bank and things like that. But those decisions made it worse. And Victoria experienced, for the first time, I suspect since the 1890s, an exodus of people, in particular to New South Wales, but also to Queensland and South Australia, which also made the downturn worse. But once it was done, and it was done quickly, Victoria actually improved quite dramatically. And from about 1996 until about 2015, Victoria did better than the rest of the country. People moved back to Victoria. And in the end, the pain was sort of necessary and worth it. And the interesting thing is that although, you know, the Victorian people sort of dealt with Kennett in the same way that the British did with Winston Churchill, you know, so thanks for winning the war, Winston, now we're going to vote in a Labor government. You know, when Kennett had done what needed to be done, you know, Victorian people kind of said, well, thanks, Jeff, now we're going to elect Steve Bracks. But Steve Bracks and John Brumby basically maintained the same, so they reversed some of the spending cuts on schools and health, which went too far. But they basically maintained the same sort of policies. And then, of course, along came Dan Andrews, who did more or less the same thing that Peter Gutwein did here and that Kane and Jolly did in the 1980s. And now Victoria is widely recognised as a basket case. Tasmania isn't widely recognised outside Tasmania because we're Tasmania and, you know, half the time we're not even included on the map, let alone taken seriously as a state. So most people don't recognise it. But, you know, what happened in Victoria is, I suppose, an example that you can't fix the problem that has been created without some pain. But the sooner you recognise that, the less the pain will ultimately be.
Great. Thank you for that response. I'm just going to take one more question from the floor.
Saul Krishnavidu, son of a hydro engineer. When it was the hydro that built the dams, that made the electricity, distributed electricity and sold the electricity, and we all popped in and paid a bill to them. Why, and I noticed your slide tonight showing the 3 divisions, why are we doing that? And if we didn't, if we just had the one entity, would we actually save some worthwhile money from that operation?
The disaggregation of the old Hydroelectric Commission was mandated by the competition policy of that era. I mean, the Hilmer inquiry and all of that sort of thing, and it happened in every state. You know, even in Western Australia, where, you know, as I mentioned, the state government still owns the entire electricity supply chain. They have a generator, a poles and wires business, and a retailer. I think it's called Western Power or something like that. I can't remember exactly what its name is. And the intention behind that was to open up the possibility of competition in the generating business and in the retailing business. Now, in most mainland states, apart from Western Australia and Queensland, there is competition in the generating business. You've got in South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, you've got AGL Origin and Energy Australia that do compete with each other to sell electricity into the grid. And in each of those states, particularly New South Wales and Victoria, you do have some choice of retailer. We don't really here have much choice of retailer. I mean, there are a few little minnows competing with Aurora, but most people are Aurora customers. That's partly economy, you know, the fact that we're a small state and a lot of potential competitors wouldn't think there was much point in setting up here. We do have a bit of competition in generation. I mean, Hydro does most of it, and they, of course, now own the Tamar Valley station as well. But you know, there are wind generators that also compete, and although I think, you know, you don't get much reward for having solar panels on your roof, that is nonetheless a growing source of energy generation in Tasmania as well. So it hasn't worked as well in Tasmania as it has in other jurisdictions, but the potential is there. The Giddings government did, as you might call, try to sell Aurora. And the Labor government of Peter Beattie in Queensland sold the Brisbane energy retailer. I think it's called Sun Power or something now. But they didn't get any bids for Aurora. The reason for that, which I don't think is generally known, is that the people who might have bid for it, this was 2011, 2012, assumed that the Libs would win the election in 2014 and that they would put hydro on the block so that they could then create vertically integrated producers and retailers, such as you have in Victoria and New South Wales now. And of course, the Libs didn't put hydro on the generator on the block, and they're not going to put hydro on the block. So that may well not happen. I'm not going to preempt what the advice I'm going to give to the government about Aurora or Tas Networks might be, because A, it would be the wrong thing to do, but B, I haven't actually done any of the work on it yet. You know, I meant to complete that by the 29th of May. So I'm not going to preempt that, but the reason it happened was in conformance with federal competition policy.
So I think we could have an entire session just on energy, a great note to finish on. I know one of interest to a lot of people, but sadly we have reached the end of our discussion for today. Once again, please show your appreciation to Saul Eslake.